Get your daily roundup on the coronavirus outbreak from the Coronavirus Global Update podcast. With reports from affected areas, details of the latest medical information, plus the impact on health, business and travel. Available from bbc.com or your podcast provider.
This is BBC News with the latest headlines for viewers in the UK and around the world. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson sticks by his top aide over claims Dominic Cummings broke the lockdown rules by travelling hundreds of kilometres.
I think he followed the instincts of every father and every parent, and I do not mark him down for that.
But mounting calls for Mr Cummings to resign will overshadow today's cabinet discussions on lifting coronavirus restrictions. Parents and teachers in England are told to prepare for the return of more pupils to schools from next Monday as planned. Away from UK politics, police and protesters in Hong Kong clash over China's plans to impose a new security law on the territory. Greece is reopening its islands to domestic tourists in the latest move towards ending its lockdown restrictions. And the United States suspends travel from Brazil for non-Americans because of the high number of coronavirus cases. Hello and welcome if you're watching in the UK or around the world, and do stay with us for the latest news and analysis from here and across the globe. I'm Anita McVeigh. Here in London, there's mounting pressure on the Prime Minister to fire his key advisor, Dominic Cummings, for travelling across the country during the coronavirus lockdown. Conservative backbenchers, the opposition Labour Party and some scientists have condemned Mr Cummings' apparent flouting of the government guidance, with many accusing him of seriously undermining public confidence in measures to halt the spread of COVID-19. Boris Johnson says his advisor acted responsibly, legally and with integrity. The Cabinet meets later today to discuss the latest moves to ease the lockdown in England. Our correspondent Simon Jones reports.
Have you undermined the message, Mr Cummings?
Leaving Downing Street with the backing of the Prime Minister. But there are growing calls for Dominic Cummings to quit or be fired. He's accused of breaking lockdown rules by travelling to Durham when his wife had coronavirus symptoms, so they could be close to other family members in case they needed help caring for their young son.
I think he followed the instincts of every father and every parent, and I do not mark him down for that. I believe that in every respect he has acted responsibly and legally and with integrity.
The UK was placed into lockdown on the 23rd of March with strict limitations on travel. The government guidelines stated you should not be visiting family members who do not live in your home. The last time Dominic Cummings was seen before developing coronavirus symptoms was in London on the 27th of March. 4 days later, Durham police said it was made aware of reports that an individual had travelled from London to Durham. On the 12th of April, newspaper reports suggested Mr Cummings was spotted in the town of Barnard Castle, 30 miles from his parents' home. 2 days later, he was photographed back in Downing Street. But on the 19th of April, it's alleged Mr Cummings again travelled to the northeast. Number 10 says this is false. Labour wants an inquiry.
This was a huge test of the Prime Minister, and he's just failed that test. He hasn't sacked Dominic Cummings, he hasn't called for an investigation, and he's treating the British public with contempt.
The former Conservative Minister Paul Maynard tweeted, "It is a classic case of do as I say, not as I do, and it is not as if he was unfamiliar with guidance he himself helped draw up." The concern is shared by one scientist who's been advising the government.
If we undermine the unity between the population and the government, if people lose trust and lose adherence, if they stop complying with the measures which have contained the infection, then all of us will lose out because the infection will spike again and many more people will die.
Dominic Cummings was heckled as he returned home. But as the Cabinet meets today to discuss plans to further ease the lockdown, ministers are facing the accusation that it's one rule for Downing Street and one for the rest of us. Simon Jones, BBC News.
And our political correspondent, Jessica Parker, as you can see, has left Downing Street and is with me now. So that Cabinet meeting, Jessica, happening at some point later today. But, you know, inevitably, it's not going to be a focus on lifting the coronavirus restrictions. One imagines there's going to be a huge focus on what's happening with Dominic Cummings.
I mean, obviously, what they're discussing in terms of easing the lockdown is really important. It's about bringing some schools back, so primary schools, year 1, year 6, reception as well from the 1st of June, some face-to-face time for year 10 and year 12 ahead of the exams next year, and also we understand we'll hear more this week about social contact, how we can interact with one another, the reopening of non-essential retail shops as well. So really important stuff to families, to the economy as well. But this row about Dominic Cummings is overshadowing things. And I think clearly Boris Johnson last night tried to address it head on and say that he had had an extensive conversation with Mr Cummings and that he was satisfied that his chief aide had acted legally and with integrity. But one of the problems, I suppose, with that press conference is that a lot of the questions that have been asked about Mr Cummings' trip to Durham have not really been answered in detail. So was there this day trip to Barnard Castle while they were there over that Easter weekend? Did the family stop when they travelled from London to Durham at a petrol station, for example, when one of them had COVID symptoms? When did the Prime Minister know about this trip as well? So these questions rolling on into today and being put to ministers like the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson.
The guidance is incredibly extensive, and at the heart of that guidance is always the issue of safeguarding children and making sure that children are always absolutely protected. And my understanding is from what the Prime Minister said yesterday, and you saw it as I did, is that at every stage, Dominic Cummings and his family followed the guidance. At no stage did Dominic Cummings or his family break the law.
Yes, Jessica, so if the Prime Minister was attempting to, you know, put those questions to bed yesterday, he certainly hasn't done that, and he certainly hasn't quelled, criticism from many sectors of society. We've had bishops, scientists, other politicians, of course. Tell us more.
Yeah, so as you say, you've had criticism from various quarters, including a few of the scientists on these committees that advise the government on its coronavirus response. One saying that Boris Johnson had effectively trashed the public message. And of course, this comes, we're talking about how Cabinet's meeting to ease the lockdown. Messaging is very important because there was that very simple stay-at-home message, and in England we've moved to the stay alert message, already a more complicated one, and things are probably about to get more complicated as the lockdown is eased, and Boris Johnson has acknowledged that. And amongst the politicians criticising Boris Johnson, the Labour leader Keir Starmer, the Liberal Democrats, and the SNP leader and First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon.
I think he's come to the wrong judgment, and the reason why I think that matters is that the consequences are potentially so serious. As we go into the next phases of dealing with this crisis, as we start to lift lockdown restrictions and rely less on the letter of the law and more on guidance and an appeal to people's good judgment, then trust in the advice we're giving and the reasons why we're giving that advice is really important. And people, if they get any sense that it's one rule for them and another rule for people in positions of authority, then that will become very difficult. The sacrifices people have made over these last few weeks are immense.
Now, there are also rumblings of concern from Conservative MPs. Now, it's not a universal view on the Conservative backbenchers. I've spoken to MPs who don't think there's any need for Dominic Cummings to go, but equally there is now a kind of growing handful of Conservative MPs who worry that the public message has been undermined, but also, as we've been hearing this morning on your programme, saying that they are hearing from their constituents who have made big sacrifices over the past few weeks and now feel that there's a sort of double standard at play. Now, Boris Johnson said last night, or very much suggested that wasn't the case, that Dominic Cummings had stuck to the rules. But undoubtedly today, he and his chief aide under a lot of pressure.
OK, Jessica, thank you very much. Jessica Parker. Well, we mentioned there that some scientists among those criticising the Prime Minister for his handling of this situation. Joining me now is Susan McKee, Professor of Health Psychology at University College London. She's on the independent scientific pandemic influenza group on behaviours, which passes its advice to SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, which of course in turn has been advising government decision makers during this pandemic. Thank you very much, Professor, for taking the time to talk to us today. And what's your view on what Dominic Cummings has done and what the Prime Minister has said about what Mr Cummings has done over the last few days?
I should say I'm speaking here in my independent capacity, but to say that all along the Behavioural Science Advisory Committee has been publishing papers on principles of good communication, and those include being direct, honest and open in communication, treating people with respect, and very importantly, having a sense of fairness and being equitable in what one's suggesting and how one's suggesting it. And the concern here is twofold. One is it's about exceptionalism, that the rules are there in order for people not to follow their instincts when they feel like it, and it may take them into risky situations. And in order to ensure that everybody is doing everything they possibly can to stop house-to-house and community-to-community transmission. So that's the first level of concern. The other level of concern is that this is primarily a public health crisis we're in. It may be a political crisis for individuals and indeed seeming to become for the whole government in terms of their response to the situation. But it's a public health crisis where the pandemic is coming down extremely slowly. It's still hovering around just under that R of 1. And what I hope is that the British public, who've been magnificent in terms of rising to the challenge of very, very difficult circumstances for a lot of people and obeying these rules, will be bigger than some of those around them and continue to adhere to the rules so that we can get this pandemic under control and get back to the lives we all want to get back to.
So you're saying now that the public needs to essentially not listen to the Prime Minister, but to follow what they've been doing, the majority of people have been doing, for the past 8 weeks or so, the period of this lockdown, and staying at home to save lives. Is that what you're asking people to do?
I'm suggesting that people should obey the rules. And of course, that any rule could be interpreted alongside other rules, in this case, one that was developed primarily for those at risk of domestic abuse, to try and show that they're an exceptional case, to get some fuzziness around the borders. If we all interpret the rules in the way that Dominic Cummings interpreted the rules, then we will see more transmission of the virus between households and between communities. You know, to leave your house if you're ill or been living with somebody who's ill, to be in an enclosed space of a car for 3 or 4 hours, we know that viral transmission is hugely greater within an enclosed space, with 1 infected person and 2 uninfected people, to be in a situation where you go from a community of high prevalence of the virus to a low prevalence of the virus, and to be planning under circumstances of 2 people being ill to hand over a child to elderly parents who obviously are at much more risk of the consequences of COVID-19, seems to not be a responsible thing to do, even if one can find clauses developed for other circumstances that could justify one's action retrospectively.
So you think the justification that Boris Johnson gave yesterday for Dominic Cummings' behaviour, in that it was about ensuring that his child could be looked after if he and his wife were both incapacitated at the same time and wouldn't be able to, you think that simply isn't enough justification given the muddying of the message?
I think had he gone to the Prime Minister or whoever in government is the appropriate person to go to, explained the circumstances, got agreement, and that was then explained to the British public, I think that's a different matter. That is not what's happened. The story has been uncovered by journalists after the fact. It appears to have been rather not disclosed in a direct way. Lots of ministers have been jumping in to try and justify his actions. And so I think this is the problem of
Professor Ashley, can I just pick up on that because we're almost out of time, but I just want to ask an important question. Do you feel now that scientists who stand alongside the Prime Minister and other members of the Cabinet on a daily basis at the news briefing have been put in an incredibly uncomfortable position? Should there be, we talk a lot about distancing, but should there literally be separate briefings now and not seeing scientists standing alongside politicians?
I think that we're at a real risk of scientific and medical leadership being undermined by the lack of confidence in political leadership. So I think what you suggest is a very good idea, and I hope our Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor take this suggestion very seriously and have independent briefings of the press and independent briefings of the public. And we have very good organisations who could host exactly such briefings. And then I think that would really help to build up trust and scientific medical leadership, which the country is crying out for.
OK, Professor Susan McKee, thank you very much for your thoughts on this today. Greece will today reopen its islands to domestic tourists, the latest in a series of measures ending lockdown restrictions. The country has had 170 deaths from coronavirus, and its tourist industry has been badly hit by the pandemic. Ferries to the islands will be operating for citizens at a 50% capacity. Our correspondent Bethany Bell sent this update.
Greece is allowing people to go back to the islands today after around 2 months of people not being able to travel there without special permission. So that means that domestic tourists can now go to the Greek islands. People from mainland Greece can go to their holiday homes, and people on the islands can start gearing up for the tourist season, because Greece has had not been very badly affected in terms of the number of cases of coronavirus, and it's had just not very many deaths. But of course, its tourism season has been hit quite badly, and that is crucial for Greece's economy. So what they're hoping to do is that they will open up in the next couple of weeks. By mid-June, they're hoping to lift the quarantine measures and start allowing foreign tourists back. But people from countries where there are higher infection rates aren't welcome yet. But Greece says that it will keep reviewing the figures from week to week, and it hopes at least to get some sort of tourism season going this summer.
Bethany Bell in Vienna. Let's bring you some live pictures from Germany now. A judge there, this is in fact a German federal court judge who has ruled today that Volkswagen has to pay compensation to motorists who bought cars with what became known as manipulated diesel engines. So this is being seen as a big blow for the car maker in its home market, as it continues to deal with the fallout from the emissions scandal. So this is Germany's highest court for civil disputes, and it has ruled that people who bought the cars in question are entitled, in principle, to receive damages. That case was brought by an individual and now has gone to this federal court, the highest court for civil disputes, ruling that Volkswagen has to pay compensation to motorists who bought vehicles with manipulated diesel engines during the emissions scandal. And they have to get compensation. As global lockdowns start to be eased, here in the UK, half of all drivers say they'll walk more and 40% say they'll drive less. I guess one leads on to the other to maintain clean air even after the restrictions are lifted. That's according to a survey of almost 20,000 people by the motoring organisation, the AA. So will the lockdown mark a change in UK driving habits? Joining me now is the AA's president, Edmund King. Hello to you, Edmund. Thank you for talking to us. Tell us a bit more, first of all, about those key findings from your survey.
Yeah, it was quite interesting because we actually commented that the air was better, there was less congestion. And did people want to do anything after lockdown to continue with that cleaner air? And 82% generally said yes, they would take positive action. And I think some of the action they say they would take is a lesson from lockdown. People are staying more locally, they're walking in the local vicinity, they're cycling more, and they're using their car less. And some of them have indicated that they would continue doing that after lockdown. There are also broader things that they talked about. Some 26% said they would actually fly less. And also a substantial proportion said they would work from home more. And I think if there's one measure, if you like, that could help with congestion, both on the roads and public transport longer term, it probably is more people working from home. Yes. Because, yeah, if a fifth work from home, it's as good as the school holidays in terms of lack of congestion on the roads and rails. Okay. So that would make
and really good intentions here from lots of people, Edmund, but what's it going to take on a policy level to support those intentions and to turn them into something that lasts? Because, you know, you talk about people working from home, but for those who are going to go back to work, if, for example, they feel it's not safe yet to travel on public transport, if they feel there aren't enough buses, trains in service, whatever, you know, are they going to then drive instead?
Yeah, I think it will be difficult. I mean, one of the things in terms of walking from home we've talked about is better investment in broadband, because for everyone it's not perfect, so we'd need that. But also in our towns and cities, if you can't use public transport, if your journey is too long to walk or cycle, you will certainly have to drive at least part of that journey. So we've called for emergency park and cycle facilities on the edge of towns and cities, so people could drive a certain distance, park up and then walk or cycle. And the Transport Secretary did mention that in his briefing on Saturday night. So it will need efforts like that. And we have seen more towns and cities putting in more cycle lanes. That will help to give more confidence, particularly to the kind of novel cyclists out there. So it's a combination of things. But I think the main thing is, behavioural-wise, people have learned to live with their car a little bit less, and certainly for those shorter journeys close to home where people have been walking in the main, they can continue doing that.
OK, Edmund King, president of the AA, thank you very much.
Thank you.
China's Foreign Ministry office in Hong Kong has said that some actions during last year's pro-democracy protests were terrorist in nature and posed a danger to national security. The ministry's commissioner made a speech in the last couple of hours about Chinese plans to impose a new security law in the city. This weekend saw a fresh surge of protests. Police fired tear gas and water cannon at demonstrators. Danny Vincent has more.
Thousands of protesters, young and old, they gathered in a central shopping district area. They plan to march across the city to show their opposition to a national security law that Beijing has proposed. Now, very quickly, the police sprung into action. They were there in waiting. They raised flags and later they fired tear gas into the crowd. They marched, they confronted the crowd, and after that we saw somewhat of a cat and mouse game where the protesters would run down many of the narrow alleys in the centre of Hong Kong and the police would chase after them. Now, there have been many protests in Hong Kong over the last year. I'd say this is probably the biggest one we've seen this year. It's certainly the biggest one we've seen since the outbreak of the coronavirus. So this proposed law, it's managed to unite Hong Kong people willing to break the law, essentially. Many were arrested, up to 180, the police say. But people were also willing to break the social distancing measures that the government had put into place to try to stop the spread of the coronavirus.
And Danny, it's been a relatively quiet few months, I use the word advisedly, after a year or so of pro-democracy protests. Is there a feeling there that China wants this to be the final showdown, if you like, to impose its authority, to get rid of what is known as one country, two systems?
Well, the official line from Beijing is that one country, two systems is still very strong. It's an important part of Hong Kong's basic law. But if you talk to the protesters here, especially the younger protesters, they feel what they're experiencing is perhaps the last fight for Hong Kong's way of life. People for many years have said that Hong Kong's, the freedoms that Hong Kongers were guaranteed when the city was handed back to China, they've seen somewhat of a slow motion erosion of some of those rights. But the announcement that this proposal, which came from Beijing, it happened so quickly, it caught many people by surprise, and most Hong Kongers now are quite fearful about what happens next.
Danny Vincent. Japan is preparing to lift the state of emergency that was imposed on Tokyo and surrounding areas at the beginning of April after a fall in the rate of infections. The state of emergency was lifted in other parts of the country just under 2 weeks ago. Japan has succeeded in avoiding an explosive outbreak of the virus, with the number of confirmed cases nationwide below 20,000 and confirmed deaths from COVID-19 fewer than 1,000. So Japan, the latest of the countries that we've been reporting about so far today, lifting their restrictions to some extent. You're watching BBC News.
Excited to visit because every coastline in the world will be changed by what happens in that part of Antarctica. So it's all the more important that we get there with our cameras and show people the changes that are taking place.
So we've been filming out here for an hour and a half, and this is the result. And it gives you an idea of why it's so hard to operate here.
But there's also a story about getting to where we're going. It took us 5 weeks to get to the front of the glacier. Only 4 people had ever been there before. It has taken years of preparation to get the scientists out here. And because of all the delays, what I didn't expect was to be camping on ice for 5 weeks.
It's shocking, and, you know, we should all be upset by what's happening here.
This is a really important story. This is something people need to know. And if we can understand it, we can do something about it.
As the coronavirus pandemic continues, BBC News has in-depth coverage.
Nothing says returning normality in Beijing like a traffic jam.
Brazilians are confused. Do they stay at home or get back to work?
In phase 1 of Spain's easing, Madrid is still under tight restrictions. So is half the country.
See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app. And get the full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
As countries around the world move through the pandemic at different speeds, we explore what might happen as restrictions change and people adjust to a new reality. Now on BBC World News, we ask, coronavirus, what's next?
Hello and welcome to the latest in our special programmes on the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Anita McVeigh. On today's programme, we'll hear from minority communities in the US and the UK about how the pandemic has affected their lives. And an interview with Facebook's founder on what the company says it's doing to combat misinformation around coronavirus.
So if you're saying something that is going to put people at imminent risk of harm, we take that down. If you're saying something that is just wrong, but is and is spreading quickly, but isn't going to put people in imminent risk, we don't take that down, but we stop it from spreading.
Plus, don't forget, you can find the latest updates on the pandemic on our website. But first, in Afghanistan, the United Nations is warning civilian casualties at the hands of both the Taliban and the government security forces are on the rise. The UN is calling for a reduction in violence as the country tries to grapple with the spread of coronavirus. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, has more.
A fight on two fronts. A hospital under fire in Kabul as they battle against the deadly virus. A time of body armour and face masks. Trying to protect themselves against this new enemy. We've spoken to doctors across the country. There's not enough of this PPE to keep them safe. A doctor in Kabul, back at work after recovering from COVID-19, didn't want to be identified.
There's a big crisis at the moment. We have lost 3 good doctors this week because of COVID. They were in contact with the patients suspected of having it. The reason they died, they didn't have good enough PPE. Sadly, they are not amongst us today. There is a corona crisis now in Afghanistan.
A house in mourning. Betarin lost his brother Fazl, a businessman, a sister, Gul Kumar, and his brother Yusuf, a doctor, the first to be tested for COVID-19 by a system which failed the entire family.
I told the doctor that if my brother's test was positive, why didn't you call us? They told me they made a mistake. Then they tested all of us. But after 13 days of waiting, my first brother died. Then another brother and sister died. And we still haven't got our test results after 1.5 months.
He took to Facebook to vent his fury, shaming senior officials into helping him. The government says it's doing what it can.
They are absolutely right. People have died because of no testing equipment. And our health infrastructure was not designed to cope with a hyper event like the coronavirus pandemic. This caught us by surprise. A nation in the midst of violence and fighting.
There is a lockdown, but it's not strict. In a country where millions live hand to mouth, hunger is seen as a deadlier threat. Many already hurting.
I'm not scared of coronavirus, but I'm afraid of hunger. Coronavirus won't kill us, but we will definitely die from hunger.
In some mosques, they keep a safe distance in the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. In others, they believe only God can save them from their enemies. This invisible enemy may already be spreading fast next door to Iran, the region's epicenter. But there aren't enough tests to know. For now, in this emergency hospital close to Taliban front lines, the old war still takes the heaviest toll. Doctors treat victims of violence. The disease isn't expected to reach its peak for a month or more. And many worry the worst may be yet to come.
Lise Doucette reporting. In the United States, Native American communities say they've been forgotten in the coronavirus crisis. Despite making up just 2% of the population, the rate of infection amongst these communities is among the highest in the country, as Ellie Costello explains.
A roadblock in the hills of rural South Dakota. Since April, they've been operating 24/7, with tourists and hunters turned away. 2 Native American tribes say the threat of the virus, combined with their vulnerable populations and poor medical facilities, meant they had to urgently control access to their lands.
We have an inherent and sovereign right to protect the health of our people, and no one, man or woman, can dispute that right.
But now, fighting the coronavirus has got political. South Dakota's state governor said that the checkpoints must be removed, claiming the tribes had broken the law by blocking state and federal roads.
What we're looking for is clarification, respecting tribal sovereignty, which is something I always have done in my words and in my actions, but also making sure that we have the ability to protect people.
Despite their efforts, tribal leaders here haven't managed to keep the virus out of their land entirely. Last week, the Oglala Sioux tribe ordered a reservation-wide shutdown after learning that 2 residents had tested positive for COVID-19.
Let all your relatives know, all of your people know, your friends, everyone across our reservation that it will be shut down.
Elsewhere, Native American communities have been hit hard. The largest reservation in the US, Navajo Nation, is home to over 350,000 people, spanning the states of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. It's had 144 deaths from COVID-19 so far, giving it one of the highest infection rates in the country.
Navajo Nation is the land base is enormous and covers several states. But in their highly populated areas, that's where we're seeing, large cases of confirmed coronavirus infections.
In Massachusetts, the small Mashpee Wampanoag tribe are one of the few with their own health service and virus testing scheme.
Would you say that tribes have been forgotten in this pandemic?
Absolutely. Tribes are forgotten every day regardless, but in this pandemic, it just brings it more to light. It's just we don't get the attention we deserve, and we definitely have been an afterthought. We're an afterthought still right now.
Under the $2 trillion Coronavirus Relief Act, tribal governments across the United States are set to receive $8 billion to respond to the public health crisis. Tribal leaders, though, say this is not nearly enough to reverse inequality and discrimination that goes back for centuries.
Meanwhile, in Britain, the Jewish community also appears to have had a disproportionately high death toll. The BBC's John McManus has been speaking to some of the families of those affected.
YY was very special to us and our family.
Remembering a dearly loved brother, another victim of the COVID-19 virus, which has hit Britain's Jewish community particularly hard. Yankee Rothschild shared a love of singing with his brother Yechiel Yosef, known as YY. The 20-year-old lived independently in the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jewish community of Stamford Hill in North London. Then one evening on the phone, YY told Yankee he was feeling unwell. It was to be their last conversation before he was rushed to hospital.
My parents were crying. Their hands were tied. They couldn't do anything. Their son, they couldn't even go into hospital to hug him, to say goodbye properly.
YY is one of hundreds of deaths amongst all denominations of Judaism, which appear to be out of proportion to the community's small size.
This cemetery in Hertfordshire, just north of London, has been here for more than 70 years. Thousands of Britain's Jewish community have been laid to rest here. But staff say that over the weeks of March, they saw a sudden and unexpected spike in the number of funerals, many of them the result of COVID-19.
At the moment it's quiet, but in the busy period we were having around 10 to 15 a day for 6 days a week.
This is a tube or mask. So 2 ways, obviously, to get the oxygen.
Other parts of the community have also raced to adapt. The Ezra Amarpa charity in Stamford Hill has been supporting the health needs of the community for decades.
Literally from hospital beds, if they need it, down to crutches.
In the last few months, it's bought dozens of oxygen machines to lend to recovering coronavirus patients when they're discharged from hospital. But there have been accusations that some Jewish people have been slow to change their lifestyles in the face of virus warnings.
I don't know anyone who doesn't know someone who's died.
Yehudis Fletcher is a community advocate and activist. She says that some influential Jewish leaders failed to set a good example, but insists a much larger blame lies with the authorities.
There are health inequalities that are known to Public Health England about individual BAME communities, and that none of that was news, and it should have been obvious that our communities were going to be affected in a different way. Nobody took the step to say that these communities should be warned in advance. Nobody took control of the situation.
There are still people in the community, still families who are still mourning.
The message of this pandemic has been to keep healthy by staying apart. But one organisation says that for traditionally large Haredi families who often live in cramped conditions, that was impossible.
There are families who have every age group in the house, and that means you have little children all the way from 1 year old going to somebody in the house which is possibly 60 years old or above that age. That did contribute towards, the virus being more aggressive in some parts of the community, unfortunately.
Meanwhile, even as he continues to mourn his brother, Yankee says YY's life was a gift.
He brought light. He was a beacon of light in the whole community, not just in our family. He brought light to people.
John McManus reporting. As the number of dead in Brazil hovers around the 20,000 mark, its government is under ever more scrutiny, in particular its controversial president, Jair Bolsonaro. Ros Atkins has more.
In April, President Bolsonaro was asked about the rapid spread of COVID-19 in Brazil.
E daí? Lamento, quer que faça o quê? Eu sou Messias, mas não faço milagre.
By May, Brazil's number of cases was the third highest in the world. This virus, which the president had dismissed as a little flu, had killed 17,000 people, and he was being held responsible. The leading medical journal, The Lancet, put it bluntly. Perhaps the biggest threat to Brazil's COVID-19 response is its president. And this is the mayor of Sao Paulo.
When you have two viruses to combat, the coronavirus and Bolsonaro virus.
But can we explain Brazil's plight through Jair Bolsonaro alone? Well, certainly the government's initial assessment of the threat raises questions.
We paid attention to the United States, and the United States, Mr. Trump was very comfortable on saying that he would take care of that. We really thought that he had some kind of science that would be released soon.
But Donald Trump's boast turned out to be hollow. That was the former health minister, Luis Enrique Mandetta. He advocated social distancing and was fired. Next into the job was Nelson Teich. When asked about Mr. Bolsonaro's decision to reopen gyms, he replied, "Was this announced today? It didn't go through the ministry." Days later, he'd resigned. According to O Globo, he objected to the president's promotion of chloroquine. That's an anti-malarial drug, and in March, President Bolsonaro told his supporters the cure is right there. It isn't. But at the third time of asking, he does now have a health minister who's happy to proceed. Chloroquine's been cleared for COVID-19 treatment in Brazil, despite not being proven to work and nasty side effects. Now, being guided by Donald Trump, undermining the health ministry, using dismissive language, a preoccupation with an unproven drug, these are all relevant to understanding what's happened. But arguably, the lack of a nationwide lockdown has mattered even more. The president has sought to undermine that idea wherever possible. This is an anti-lockdown rally in Brasilia, and as you can see, these are not advocates of social distancing. But actually it's Brazil's states, not the president, that have the power to impose restrictions. And they've done so, but to very differing degrees. And there appear limits to what they're willing to try.
Around 40% of the labor force is in the informal economy, only partially assisted by the social safety net. A lot of those live from hand to mouth, so for them it's hard to stay inside the house when you don't have the money to buy food.
Which leads us to the economy. Brazil's currency is the worst performing in the world. Its main stock exchange index has plummeted, manufacturing is slumping, and unemployment is rising. The Brazilian economist Armando Costela has written of his country, "My investment advice would be not to run into a burning building." But how best to put out that fire? The president believes lockdowns will make matters worse, and in purely economic terms, he's right. Ecuador's president, Lenin Moreno, has defended its lockdown, but says it's as if a family has lost half of what it needs to live. And of course, this delicate balance between saving lives and saving incomes is universal in this pandemic. But the bitter political row over whether Brazil can afford a lockdown has had consequences.
At the end of the day, he's the president. People take advice from him as the leader, and that's what's been so confusing. Do people listen to Jair Bolsonaro, or do they take the advice of the state governors?
Around the world, COVID-19 has delivered a deadly lesson that while human beings are influenced by passion, politics and prejudice, viruses aren't. And to explain Brazil's failure to build an urgent, coherent national response, we must start with the president, who hasn't always appeared to want one.
The founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, has defended its record of tackling misinformation during the coronavirus outbreak. Speaking to the BBC in his first UK broadcast interview in 5 years, he said the platform removed all content which put people at imminent risk of physical harm. He's been talking to the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack.
On the immediate health risks, if some crazy person decided to start telling people to, I don't know, drink or inject bleach, or, you know, saying that colloidal silver would be a good way of keeping the virus at bay, what is the Facebook algorithm's response to that?
Well, it's not our algorithm. We have policies around this, around stopping misinformation. We basically, we break this into two categories. So there's harmful misinformation that puts people in imminent risk of physical harm. So things like saying that something is a proven cure for the virus when in fact it isn't, we will take that down. And there have been hundreds of thousands of cases of things that are harmful misinformation. Another example, which I know has been very prevalent in the UK, has been 5G misinformation, which has led to some physical damage of 5G infrastructure. So we believe that that is leading to imminent risk of physical harm. We take down that content. There have been hundreds of thousands of pieces of content like that. And we do take it down when we enforce that even no matter who's saying it. So, I mean, there was a case where the Brazilian president went out and said that it was proven by all scientists or something to that effect, that there's a drug that was proven to cure coronavirus. And you know, that's obviously not true. There's nothing yet, at least that I'm aware of, that's proven to be a cure. So we had to enforce that. Even if something isn't going to cause imminent risk of physical harm, we don't want misinformation to be the content that is broadly going viral across the network. So we work with independent fact checkers. Over the course of this period, since the COVID outbreak, they've issued about 7,500 kind of articles saying fact-checking content, which has led to us showing about 50 million warning labels on different posts across our services. And we know that those posts are effective because 95% of the time when someone sees a post that has a warning label on, they don't click through to see it. So, if you're saying something that is going to put people at imminent risk of harm, we take that down. If you're saying something that is just wrong, but is and is spreading quickly, but isn't going to put people in imminent risk, we don't take that down, but we stop it from spreading generally.
No one doubts the awesome responsibility that a company like Facebook, which has WhatsApp and Instagram, of course, has the responsibility it has in the world. I mean, your old friend Chris Hughes, who founded the company with you, who wrote a note saying that Facebook should be broken up, he said, and these were his words, Mark alone, because of the voting structure, can decide how to configure the algorithm to determine what people see in their news feeds, what privacy settings they can use, and even which messages get delivered. He sets the rules for how to distinguish violent and incendiary speech. I mean, that is, do you, hand on heart, as the controlling shareholder in Facebook, do you, hand on heart, think it is a good idea for that kind of responsibility to be vested in one human being, you?
Well, I've actually said publicly that I don't think that any one individual or any company should be making so many decisions about important values for society, like free expression and safety. And we've taken a lot of actions on that front. So, you know, just recently we've established this independent oversight board, which basically what it is, it's starting off, it's a group of about 20 experts who all, you know, folks like former judges, former Prime Minister of Denmark, academics, journalists, leaders of nonprofits, people who come from countries around the world and have a diversity of experiences, but all have a commitment and understanding of free expression and human rights. And this oversight board will make it so that people in our community can appeal if they think we're making a decision incorrectly on content. And this board will have the final binding say. So if they say that something needs to come down or needs to stay up, at that point, it doesn't even matter what I think or what the other folks on our team think. This independent board will get to make that decision. So it's I do think that there needs to be some additional governance beyond just our company making all the decisions, which is why we're taking steps like that. I think that that's very important.
That's Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg talking to Simon Jack. Finally, so many industries are facing a long road to recovery because of the pandemic, and TV productions are no exception. But in South Africa, a group of actors saw stringent lockdown restrictions as an opportunity to start a new online soap opera, which they've shot by themselves at home. It's proving so popular, it's already in its 3rd season.
Sing, clap, standing by, and action.
So when the president announced the national lockdown, I kind of sat at home and I thought to myself, well, what happens to the soapies? And so in my head, I was like, well, why don't we just create a soapie on our cell phones?
Lockdown Heights is an online Instavella, which is a telenovela that we are specifically showcasing on social media platforms. And it's really bite-sized episodes, which ranges from between 9 to 12 minutes.
We're on lockdown. I'm supposed to be in the house. We all do.
What happens is we send scripts out to actors, and each actor shoots from home on their cell phones the individual part of the episode or the scene, of which they're now edited together, and it comes across as, when it comes together, it comes across as people are in the same space.
And obviously you gotta do whatever you can to get the shot. Oh my goodness. This is my tripod.
Wow, girl, you're dangerous. Get out of my frame! What are you doing?
I would literally just call out actors that I know, friends, people I've worked with in the past, and they were just excited. Everyone was like keen to go into a space they do not know.
I can't believe you tried to steal from me, Times. I'm sorry, I don't know what else to do. Let me just call him and set this thing up so we can finally be done your mess.
It grants us an opportunity as artists to stay creative during this period, for us to collaborate with one another and just to create something that's fresh and new, because we are moving into a format that we haven't explored before.
I can't stop thinking about how they felt when I kissed them. Well, I am right here.
My message to all of the actors and even the crew out there that has been affected by the COVID-19 virus within this space is always stay creative, always look for opportunities for creative ways of storytelling, of characterization, of shooting.
New innovative ways of storytelling are going to be unraveled, and shows like Lockdown Heights are here to pioneer that kind of innovation.
And cut!
That's it for now. A reminder, you can follow me on Twitter at Anita_McVeigh, or head to the BBC News website for the latest information. Thanks for watching.
Here in Turkey, it's the first phase of what's been called a normalisation plan. Shopping malls can reopen, but temperatures will be taken on the way in.
No politician here wants to squander that initial success by returning to normal life, by lifting all those restrictions too quickly.
The coronavirus is becoming a defining, and some would say deeply unsettling, moment in the relationship between the world's two economic superpowers.
It is far from normal. Monitoring, surveillance of some kind are likely to be a key part of the route out of lockdown.
We break stories from more places than any other international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.
COVID-19 is a global crisis, and the whole world is talking about it. But not everything you hear is true. False information is spreading, and it's putting people in danger. For accurate information on COVID-19, find official advice from your country's public health authority or the World Health Organization. Double-check everything you hear against these trusted sources. Stop the spread.
Hello there. Let's take a look at what's happening across the globe, starting off in North America, and plenty to talk about at the moment. We're tracking this massive cloud moving out of the plains down into Texas. It's a weather front that's going to bring some pretty intense showers, heavy with rumbles of thunder and some large hail as it continues to track its way steadily east. There will be a few scattered showers across the eastern coast, and we'll see more heavy persistent rain into Florida as well. Behind all this, down into the desert southwest, it's all about the extreme heat that's building, and fire alerts remain in force here. Now, elsewhere, it looks as though temperatures will sit at 27 degrees with some of that warmth into San Francisco, 27 degrees across the southeast into Florida as well. For Mexico, it's fine and settled. We've got some more intense rain down into Costa Rica and Panama, some heavier rain across parts of the Caribbean, particularly into Cuba, and those showers are expected to continue for the next few days. Picking up some showers across the far north of South America, as you can see through Venezuela over towards northern Brazil. Fine and settled behind a good deal of dry weather, with more wet and windy weather pushing into the southern tip of Chile. West-east divide across Europe at the moment, with best of the sunshine and the warmth through Spain up into France. Cloudy across Berlin, but some pretty intense showers moving out of Poland all the way down into mainland Greece, but not as warm in the southeast Mediterranean as it has been. And not as warm across North Africa, with the winds coming back off the Mediterranean, so a cooler feel to things into Cairo. There's our seasonal showers and a weather front just easing away from South Africa, taking outbreaks of rain with it from Cape Town. Quiet weather story across the Middle East at the moment, with just a light breeze. It's all about the heat that's building now at this time of year, fairly oppressive by the middle of the afternoon. Across to South Asia, got a few showers into Sri Lanka and along the Kerala coastline. And the remnants still of Umpum still causing some issues across northeastern states of India and into Bangladesh, where we are still likely to see some heavy flooding rains over the next couple of days. Across to China, we've been tracking this area of low pressure, which is bringing some heavy rain across central and eastern China at the moment. The brighter, vibrant colours denoting this. Ahead of it, it's dry and settled across Japan. A few scattered showers into the Philippines, more extensive further south. And we've got our usual showers generally through Malaysia and Indonesia. Now moving out to Australia, where we have seen some significant weather across Western Australia, and this storm will continue. It's Storm Manga to ease away through the Bight. It's going to take some pretty strong winds with it as well, but certainly an improving picture here. A few scattered showers across the east coast, and a better story across New Zealand after recent heavy rain in the North Island continues to ease away as well. More 5-day city forecasts, if you're interested, can always be found online. Take care.
How we've been affecting the climate? We have. We know that perfectly well. So that we have to realise that this is not playing games.
Well, I think it's very important that we have people from different backgrounds, different generations and different genders in places of power.
We're going to start building new relationships with friends and partners around the world.
The DNA of Indonesian society is tolerance, moderate. That is what I see.
We don't have a need to declare ourselves an independent state. We are an independent country.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
This is BBC News with the latest headlines for viewers in the UK and around the world. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson sticks by his top aide over claims Dominic Cummings broke the lockdown rules by travelling across the country.
I think he followed the instincts of every father and every parent, and I do not mark him down for that.
Mounting calls for Dominic Cummings to resign will overshadow today's cabinet discussions on lifting COVID-19 restrictions. A top German court rules Volkswagen must pay compensation to motorists who purchased diesel cars that the company modified to appear less polluting. Japan prepares to lift its state of emergency in Tokyo and surrounding areas after a fall in the rate of infections. And parents and teachers are told to prepare for the return of more pupils to schools in England from next Monday, as planned. Hello and welcome. If you're watching in the UK or around the world, stay with us for the latest news and analysis from here and across the globe. There's mounting pressure on the Prime Minister Boris Johnson to fire his key advisor Dominic Cummings for travelling across the country during the COVID-19 lockdown. Conservative backbenchers, the opposition Labour Party and some scientists have condemned Mr Cummings' apparent flouting of the government guidance, with many accusing him of seriously undermining public confidence in measures to halt the spread of COVID-19. Boris Johnson says his advisor acted responsibly, legally and with integrity. The Cabinet meets this afternoon to discuss the latest moves to ease the lockdown in England. Our correspondent Simon Jones reports.
Have you undermined the message, Mr Cummings?
Leaving Downing Street with the backing of the Prime Minister. But there are growing calls for Dominic Cummings to quit or be fired. He's accused of breaking lockdown rules by travelling to Durham when his wife had coronavirus symptoms, so they could be close to other family members in case they needed help caring for their young son.
I think he followed the instincts of every father and every parent, and I do not mark him down for that. I believe that in every respect he has acted responsibly and legally and with integrity.
The UK was placed into lockdown on the 23rd of March with strict limitations on travel. The government guidelines stated you should not be visiting family members who do not live in your home. The last time Dominic Cummings was seen before developing coronavirus symptoms was in London on the 27th of March. 4 days later, Durham police said it was made aware of reports that an individual had travelled from London to Durham. On the 12th of April, newspaper reports suggested Mr Cummings was spotted in the town of Barnard Castle, 30 miles from his parents' home. 2 days later, he was photographed back in Downing Street. But on the 19th of April, it's alleged Mr Cummings again travelled to the northeast. Number 10 says this is false. Labour wants an inquiry.
This was a huge test of the Prime Minister, and he's just failed that test. He hasn't sacked Dominic Cummings, he hasn't called for an investigation, and he's treating the British public with contempt.
The former Conservative Minister Paul Maynard tweeted, "It is a classic case of do as I say, not as I do, and it is not as if he was unfamiliar with guidance he himself helped draw up." The concern is shared by one scientist who's been advising the government.
If we undermine the unity between the population and the government, if people lose trust and lose adherence, if they stop complying with the measures which have contained the infection, then all of us will lose out because the infection will spike again and many more people will die.
Dominic Cummings was heckled as he returned home. But as the Cabinet meets today to discuss plans to further ease the lockdown, ministers are facing the accusation that it's one rule for Downing Street and one for the rest of us. Simon Jones, BBC News.
Well, let's go to our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, outside the Prime Minister's office at Downing Street in London. Vicky, the Dominic Cummings row continuing to really overshadow everything else.
Yeah, and I think it will, because I think people feel there are still some unanswered questions, particularly about whether he made a trip to a castle on Easter Sunday when the guidelines clearly said that you should be staying at home, that you only travel if that journey is essential. Now, of course, I think people looking at this and people who've listened to this over the last couple of days will think, yes, you can, of course, go through these pages and pages of guidelines. There's a lot of them, and there are exemptions. You could do that, but of course, in the end, I think most people know what they were being asked to do at around that time, and it was to stay at home. The other interesting thing to all of this, I think, is the fact that now people are talking about the Prime Minister's judgment by standing up yesterday and defending his advisor. it is not just now about what Dominic Cummings did, it's about what the Prime Minister knew. Did he sanction this? Did he know about it at the time? And people saying, actually, he has made a wrong judgment here in keeping his advisor. And as you say, dominating everything, cabinet ministers who are giving interviews, sure to be asked about this time and time again. Exactly what happened to the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, this morning.
The guidance is incredibly extensive, and at the heart of that guidance is always the issue of safeguarding children and making sure that children are always absolutely protected. And my understanding is from what the Prime Minister said yesterday, and you saw it as I did, is that at every stage Dominic Cummings and his family followed the guidance. At no stage did Dominic Cummings or his family break the law.
Now, of course, the issue with the Prime Minister saying that Dominic Cummings followed his instinct as a parent, there are lots of parents around the country who have been in a similar position and didn't act in this way. And that is the other point about this. This is not normal times. The coronavirus, the restrictions placed on everyone have affected absolutely everybody in the country. And that's why I think there is this anger. Now, Conservative MPs say they have been emailed and contacted by constituents. A lot of them now saying that they feel there needs to be an investigation into what happened in order to get the facts straight. And now Nicola Sturgeon, who went through something similar with an advisor. You remember in Scotland, her chief medical officer was found to have travelled to a second home during lockdown. She resigned. This is what Nicola Sturgeon makes of what's going on here.
I think he's come to the wrong judgment, and the reason why I think that matters is that the consequences are potentially so serious. As we go into the next phases of dealing with this crisis, as we start to lift lockdown restrictions and rely less on the letter of the law and more on guidance and appeal to people's good judgment, then trust in the advice we're giving and the reasons why we're giving that advice is really important. And people, if they get any sense that it's one rule for them and another rule for people in positions of authority, then that will become very difficult. The sacrifices people have made over these last few weeks are immense.
And I think that's the point that some Conservative MPs are worried about, that this undermines those clear messages from the government. Now, at the moment, there are going to be announcements about unlocking and easing those restrictions, but, there could come a time when more restrictions need to be placed back on people. And what they don't want is that message undermined by things that officials here might have done.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Well, let's go now to Professor Robert West, Professor of Health Psychology at University College London and a government scientific advisor. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. The Prime Minister said that Dominic Cummings followed the instinct of every parent. He acted responsibly, legally and with integrity. Do you agree?
I think that he did follow the instinct of a parent, and that's precisely the problem. And the Prime Minister should have realised that the reason why these guidelines and rules were put in place is because people will have very difficult choices to make in their lives. And I think, as the previous clips have shown, many people, thousands of people in the country, have made that judgment and have stuck to the rules at great cost to themselves and in many cases to their loved ones, and are continuing to do so and need to do so. So when they see someone in a position of power and authority not doing that, then that's problematic. But then when they see the Prime Minister of the country saying, well, actually, it's okay to follow your instinct as a father, and somehow making a virtue of it, I think this is where, a lot of people have really struggled to understand, why he would do that.
We'll come on to how people might react going forward, but just looking back to what actually happened, Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, this morning was saying at every stage he followed the guidelines. He didn't do anything illegal. In a very straightforward way, was what he did following the guidelines?
The guidelines have, at that stage, were very clear in a way that they said stay at home was the guidance. However, it was recognised that this cannot apply in every single situation, and so there were some exemptions put in place. And these were things like, if you find yourself in an abusive relationship and you need to seek refuge, then of course, you must go out of the home and do that. Or if you have a situation where you've got a very sick child and you need to leave the home in order to be able to address that situation. So the exceptions were there for really very serious problematic situations. Now, in a situation like this, if you've got a senior government advisor or indeed a government minister, the natural thing to do would be, if you really have concerns, would be to seek advice from the cabinet secretary or someone high up in the civil service about what you should do. And if they then say, I understand you're in a very difficult situation, okay, that should be fine, then that's okay. Now, whether he did that or not, I don't know. If he had done that, I would have expected him to say so. And then I think people might have understood that even though the judgment might have been wrong, at least it was made in good faith.
Coming on to where people out there, the general public, might take this going forward. We are now in a different stage of this. We are being told to use our common sense, to use our own judgment. What impact do you think it might have on the integrity of the lockdown and people doing the right thing to stop the spread of the disease?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously it's put this at risk, but I think the key thing that everyone needs to remember is that the reason why we are adhering to these rules is not for Dominic Cummings or the Prime Minister. It's for ourselves, for our loved ones, for our friends and family, and for the community at large. And those principles remain. That's why we're doing it. So, even though there appears to have been, quite a substantial failure of leadership, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to sort of, take things into our own hands and somehow behave in a way that's going to cause harm to the community. So the guidance remains. And I think one of the things that we also need to do is to restore confidence in the systems that we're going to be using going forward. For example, as we go from a sort of blanket lockdown type social distancing situation to something that's more nuanced, we're going to be relying more on testing, contact tracing and isolation. And that does require a high degree of trust and confidence in the system. And I think the government's got a really big job of work to do to restore that confidence and to get that system up and running in a way that people will say, yes, I'm willing to go along with that.
Professor Robert West, thank you very much. In the past hour, Germany's top court has ruled Volkswagen should pay compensation to motorists who bought cars fitted with emissions-cheating software. The car maker has already paid billions of dollars in fines for installing software designed to artificially improve its emissions test results. Let's speak to our correspondent in Berlin, Jenny Hill, for more on this. Jenny, just remind us about the details of this case, because it was one man who took Volkswagen to court saying he basically wanted his money back, having bought a car on a false premise.
Yes, you're quite right. This is a pensioner who bought a VW Charan back in 2014. He says he bought it in good faith. Once the emissions scandal came to light, he went to Volkswagen saying he wanted them to take the vehicle back off him and refund him his money. Today, Germany's top civil court has, by and large, agreed with him. They say that VW must buy the car back, but the money that the man will get will be a little less than the vehicle's original value. That's to compensate for wear and tear, depreciation and so on. He's going to get around 25,000 euros though. And this is quite a big moment here in Germany, because there are around 60,000 other VW owners out there who've lodged similar complaints in the courts. So this could, in some respects, open the floodgates to a degree. I mean, actually, when you look at the sums of money involved, this man's getting 25,000 euros back, times that, or a little bit less than that, by 60,000 people. Actually, this is going to run into the millions compared to the 30 billion euros bill that this company has already already paid out in fines and regulatory fees and so on, compensation in other parts of the world so far. It's actually not a huge amount of money.
It's been back and forth in the courts with appeals. Is this it, or is there possibly going to be further appeals?
Well, these tens of thousands of other complainants will now see this as a very positive moment for them, so their cases are likely to continue and be heard. VW had already settled out of court with several 100,000 car owners here in Germany, far less amounts in terms of payments to them. But that sort of collective action, as it's known here, has been dealt with. There are other ramifications. So we're 5 years after VW actually finally admitted that it had been cheating those emissions tests, and the ramifications are still coming. And there are other actions still outstanding, including actions being taken by shareholders, investors who say that they lost a lot of money when their share value plummeted after that admission. So there are still a lot of court cases outstanding. A number of executives have been charged with various charges over the years too. And just last week we heard that the current chief executive and the current chair of the Financial Supervisory Board have now, after a payment of €9 billion by VW, now no longer face charges over what the courts were suggesting was their part in the scandal. But yet another executive still faces charges. So, this isn't over yet by a long stretch. And, of course, what lasts even longer, and it's hard to imagine this ever going away, is the stain left on the reputation of this huge German car maker.
Thank you very much. The Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has lifted the nationwide state of emergency imposed to stop the spread of coronavirus. Restrictions had already been eased in most of the country, but had remained in force in Tokyo and surrounding areas. Despite more relaxed lockdown rules than in most European countries, Japan has so far avoided an explosive outbreak of the virus. Our correspondent in Tokyo, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, has more on the easing of restrictions that comes into effect later today.
After 7 weeks, the state of emergency here in Tokyo is about to be lifted. The panel of experts who've been advising Prime Minister Shinzo Abe met here in Tokyo this afternoon, and they decided that the infection rate is below the 0.5 per 100,000 level, which is the rate at which they think it is safe to start reopening the city. As you can see, most people haven't actually waited. It's a Monday afternoon here. Well, if you'd come here over the weekend, it's been great weather here in Tokyo the last few days. And this place was jammed. Like everywhere else in the world, people are bored. They want this to be over. What's remarkable, though, is here in Japan, we've never really had the sort of lockdowns that have happened in cities in Europe and North America. And yet, at the same time, Japan has managed to keep both the infection rate, but more importantly, the mortality rate from COVID-19 very, very low. As of yesterday, the number of people who've died from the disease here in Japan was just 830. Why that is not clear. There are lots of theories. There are, for example, people talking about the fact that everybody here wears masks. This is not a new thing that's just happened in the last few weeks. For years and years, decades here in Japan, if you get a cold, if you get a cough, it is normal for you to wear a mask. There are many cultural customs in Japan that may have contributed to stopping the spread of infection. People, for example, don't shake hands, they bow. People take their shoes off when they go into buildings. Hygiene levels here are generally very, very high. And there's one other thing that people have been mentioning as perhaps significant. Japan has, by far, the lowest level of obesity in the whole of the developed world.
Rupert Wingfield-Hayes. A number of Church of England bishops have taken to Twitter to accuse Boris Johnson of treating people like mugs and having no respect after he backed his chief aide, Dominic Cummings. The Bishop of Bristol, Vivian Falls, said living differently in a nation where the Prime Minister has no respect for the people, the bonds of peace and our common life have been dangerously undermined this evening. The Bishop of Leeds, Nick Baines, said the question is, do we accept being lied to, patronised and treated by a Prime Minister as mugs? The moral question is not for Cummings, it's for the PM and ministers who find this behaviour acceptable. In Sheffield, Bishop Pete Wilcox tweeted, "Tonight, I must say the PM and his cabinet are undermining the trust of the electorate, and the risks to life are are real. The Bishop of Reading, Olivia Graham, said, "I find myself deeply worried by the PM's judgment call on this one, not from a political perspective, but a moral one. His response lacks both integrity and respect, and he has just made his task of leading us through this crisis much, much harder." Joining us now is Dr. David Walker, the Bishop of Manchester. Thank you very much for joining us. What's your view of all of this?
Well, I think I agree with pretty well what my colleagues are saying. I think I was stunned yesterday evening by the press conference from Downing Street. Religions have had thousands of years of saying actually human instinct on its own is not good enough. We need rules, we need virtues, we need values, we need guidelines. And then the Prime Minister basically says, actually, you can trust your instincts. If we all do that, then we're not going to get out of this COVID crisis.
Are you comfortable that we know enough for people to be piling in and saying these things as strongly as they are? I mean, Dominic Cummings obviously says he's done nothing wrong. The Prime Minister says he's confident he's done nothing wrong. Don't you trust either of them?
I think there's a rule in public life that when a story gets as big as this, what needs to happen is very, very quickly you get out there all the news, whether it's good, bad, whatever it is, and then you've got a position you can defend. What we're struggling with at the moment is we're not being told. We're told that some of the things that are being said about Mr. Cummings are palpable lies, but we're not being told which things are true, which things are false. So it's very, very hard to understand what's going on. And it's that sense of deception there that we're being either lied to or at the very least things are being hidden from us that we need to know in order that we, the people of this country, can really understand that we are all in it together. And that sense of being in it together is absolutely essential to our corporate coping with the crisis. If we feel it's one rule for some and a different rule for others, then we'll all go our own way, and we'll find further peaks of the disease, we'll find further unacceptable levels of death.
So what do you think should happen next?
Well, I'm hoping that the Prime Minister, and he didn't look well at all last night, I'm hoping that having had a night's sleep and perhaps a restful morning, his cabinet meeting, I'm hoping that they may be able to come out and say, look, we got this wrong. We're sorry, we got it wrong. We let down the British people. I think that probably does mean that Mr. Cummings' position is untenable at the heart of government. But I think if we can have that sense, look, we did get it wrong, we misjudged the public mood, we're sorry, we've learned, I think that will enable us to rebuild the trust that we need to get through with this crisis.
What about trust in the Prime Minister?
Well, he doesn't look a well man here. We know that people who've had COVID-19 are quite ill for quite some time afterwards. It affects the body, the mind, the whole of the person. He really did not look a well man last night. I think I cut him some slack for that. But other advisors, cabinet colleagues around him need to actually say to him, look, Boris, you got that wrong. Just say you got it wrong. Everybody can forgive a sinner who's repentant. Say you got it wrong and we can move on. I think if he does that, I think we can put this behind us and get on with the real job, get on with the real task of tracking and tracing, of making sure that we cut this disease out of our society.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just got a statement through actually from the acting Durham Police Crime and Victims Commissioner Steve White, who said, "I'm confident that thus far Durham Police has responded proportionately and appropriately to the issues raised concerning Mr Cummings and his visit to the county at the end of March. It is clear, however, that there is a plethora of additional information circulating in the public domain which deserves appropriate examination. I have today written to the Chief Constable asking her to establish the facts concerning any potential breach of the law or regulations in this matter at any juncture. It is vital that the force can show it has the interests of the people of County Durham and Darlington at its heart, so that the model of policing by consent, independent of government but answerable to the law, is maintained. It will be for the Chief Constable to determine the operational response to this request, and I'm confident that with the resources at its disposal, the force can show proportionality and fairness in what has become a major issue of public interest and trust." That statement just through from the acting Durham Police Crime and Victims Commissioner Steve White. Now, Greeks are once again able to travel freely to the country's islands as part of measures to ease lockdown restrictions. The return of domestic travel is an important step towards restarting the wider tourism industry, which makes up at least a fifth of the Greek economy. Ferry services to the islands are operating with reduced capacity to ensure social distancing, and passengers are having their temperatures checked. Nikos Vulgaridis is the owner of Kokini Porta Rossa Hotel and joins me now live from Rome. Thank you very much for joining us. So you're preparing to welcome your first guests?
Well, we certainly hope so. We're going to accept our first guests around the 1st of July in the islands, and we very much look forward to it.
What impact has the lockdown had on you?
Well, to start with, we all feel blessed here because we're all healthy, we live in a lovely place, and we have been very little affected other than financially by the crisis. Now, business is another thing altogether. Being dependent on tourism, the islands are almost 100% dependent on it, we're going to be affected very severely. But we're going to make the best of it. We hope that people from abroad will be able to travel soon and visit us. The weather is lovely, the place is beautiful, and we're a very safe destination compared to other places. So we are going to have a very bad season financially, but we are going to cope, and we're all here.
Have there been any cases of COVID-19 on roads?
I think 2 ladies flew from Europe a couple of months ago, and that was it. It is either 2 or 3 cases that have been hospitalized and then sent back home.
OK, so I'm wondering, though, whether you're worried about the prospect of an influx of tourism perhaps bringing COVID-19. How can locals and guests be reassured that it's going to be safe?
Well, we have all very well been informed by the authorities, and the way we're all going to operate, all kinds of accommodation, hotels and Airbnbs and resort hotels, it's going to be done in a way that will ensure that everything is going to be done very safely for both our guests and ourselves. I think that the way things are now and the way things are being done, the risk is going to be minimal because, as we understand it, we're going to start accepting guests from countries that are rather safe now, and then gradually it's going to be increased and progress to other countries that are currently not as safe as others are. So I think that it's going to be fine.
I mean, obviously you described that economically it's taken a big hit. How
yes.
have you been surviving? And if tourism doesn't really pick up, are you worried about the viability of your business going forward?
Not our business. Our business is going to be okay. We're not happy with the situation, but we're going to do fine. I'm worried about other businesses. They're going to struggle a lot, and also individuals will. The thing is that for a change, we appear to have a government that looks as if they know very well what they're doing. And also for a change, we, the people, have been behaving exactly the way we should. So it looks as if we are over the virus situation, and now what we see as far as finance goes and business goes, the government is doing things the right way, and we feel secure that we're going to be okay. They have convinced us, most of us, to open our hotels and restaurants, etc. They're going to help people be paid what they would otherwise be, that is, employees. And they are helping us, the business people, with taxes and other ways to survive, to keep afloat.
Nikos Volgoridis, thank you very much for joining us. Wishing you all the very best.
I hope the British will visit because they are a big chunk of the business we have, and it's traditionally a destination for the British. And we hope that soon you will be able to travel, and we look very much forward to seeing you with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Bye.
Western Australia has been battered by a huge storm, ripping roofs off houses, downing trees and leaving more than 60,000 homes without power. Most were in the city of Perth. The state's south was particularly hard hit with dust storms and torrential rain, as well as huge waves along the coast. Officials said no injuries were reported. Authorities had warned residents to prepare for a once-in-a-decade storm. New Zealand has been rocked by a 5.8 magnitude earthquake while the country's Prime Minister was in the middle of a live television interview. The earthquake struck 30 kilometres off the coast of the country's North Island, and although no damages were reported, it lasted for more than 30 seconds. Ms Arden, who was in the country's Parliament building, known as the Beehive when the quake hit, was remarkably calm under pressure.
We're just having a bit of an earthquake here, Ryan. Quite a decent shake here, but if you see things moving behind me, the Beehive moves a little more than most.
Jacinda Ardern. The UK Prime Minister, we're doing our headlines now. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson sticks by his top aide over claims Dominic Cummings broke the lockdown rules by travelling across the country. Mounting calls for Mr Cummings to resign will overshadow today's cabinet discussions on lifting COVID-19 restrictions. A top German court rules Volkswagen must pay compensation to motorists who purchased diesel cars that the company modified to appear less polluting. Japan prepares to lift its state of emergency in Tokyo and surrounding areas after a fall in the rate of infections. And parents and teachers are told to prepare for the return of more pupils to schools in England from next Monday as planned.